Good evening. Welcome to the Martin Luther King Jr. International Chapel Thursday Thurman Theological Table Talk with Dr. Int'l Carrera at Morehouse College. On behalf of Dr. Lawrence Carter Sr., the founding dean of the Martin Luther King Jr. International Chapel, as well as Reverend Quincy Reinhardt, the associate campus minister, we welcome you to our virtual audience and to this Thursday Theological Table Talk. My name is Winfred Rice Jr., and I am an adjunct professor of religion and alumnus of the college, and I will serve as our moderator this evening. Tonight, our topic is centered around social justice, philosophy, and anti-Blackness. To ground us for the discussion tonight, I'd like to lift a meditation from Calvin Warren's text, Ontological Terror, Blackness, Nihilism, and Emancipation, which centers around anti-Blackness. Listen carefully to what Calvin Warren suggests. A mentor once asked me a terrifying question. Why are all Blacks hated all over the world? Stunned, I remained silent, but the question remained with me. This book, in many ways, is a return to my mentor's question, a question that might lack any sufficient answer, but a question that must be presented nonetheless. We can call this hatred anti-Blackness, an accretion of practices, knowledge systems, and institutions designed to impose nothing onto Blackness, and the unending domination, eradication of Black presence as nothing incarnated. Put differently, anti-Blackness is anti-nothing. What is hated about Blacks is this nothing. The ontological terror they must embody for the metaphysical world. Every lynching, every castration, every rape, every shooting, and every murder of Blacks is an engagement with this nothing and the fantasy that nothing can be dominated once and for all. Anti-Blackness provides the instruments and frameworks for binary thinking, the thinking of being as presence. For example, the obsession with physicality and skin complexion, the objectification of being. One only needs to think of slaveholders as the extremity of Heidegger's metaphysical nightmare, for example, in technocratic oppression, that is, racial surveillance, police warfare, equipment, etc. Blacks have been obliterated, and this is what we will call the metaphysical Holocaust. The systematic concealment, dissent, and withholding of Blackness through technologies of terror, violence, and objection. This then is the devastation of the metaphysical Holocaust. Black being never becomes or stands forth, but exists in concealment, falling, and inconsistency. When I say then that Blacks lack being but have existence, I mean they inhabit the world in concealment and non-movement. When I say that Blacks lack being but have existence, I mean they inhabit the world in concealment and in non-movement. This is a reading tonight, again, from Calvin Warren's text, Ontological Terror, Blackness, Nihilism, and Emancipation. Tonight, we are privileged to have with us Dr. Int'l Carrera, who is an assistant professor of philosophy at Emory University. Her areas of specialization are in 20th century continental philosophy, the critical philosophy of race, contemporary critical theories, and environmental humanities. Dr. Carrera received her PhD from Penn State University in 2015 and her BA from New York University in 2009. In her dissertation, Re-Theorizing Fanon, she showed how many themes in the works of Frantz Fanon had been significantly under-theorized. She thus proposed to probe different philosophical avenues for interpreting his work. She explored, as opposed to the traditional reliance on phenomenology and existential philosophy, she explored new hermeneutical routes by using political philosophies with the aim of demonstrating how Fanon's work remains importantly relevant to the current practices of combating issues of war, racism, and violence. Her most recent publications include Black Feminist Philosophy and the Politics of Refusal, and her forthcoming work centers around Blackness and Ontology, the Climate of Race. I invite you now to lend your minds, and ears to our presenter, Dr. Carrera.
I hope you can all hear me. I can't see you. Can you hear me at all? Yes? Yes? Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good. I couldn't really tell. Thank you for that kind of introduction. And thank you all for inviting me here. I very much look forward to the discussion afterwards. And thank you also for reading that beautiful passage from Ontological Terror, because in many ways I think it echoes some of the things that I will be talking about today. The question of Blackness or anti-Blackness and philosophy, or Blackness and philosophy, or the task of attempting to understand Blackness from a philosophical point of view can surely be engaged from different, or confronted from different angles. Dr. Warren sort of staged his intervention at the level of ontology. And I think his intervention in ontological terror in many ways signals a kind of what we might call an ontological turn in Black studies. And ontological terror is definitely a decisive text for that turn. You, in your introduction of the introduction you did, your kind of introduction, you did mention my dissertation, which I did write on the work of Frantz Fanon. But I've changed slightly the gears of my research, and I am currently writing a book on ecology, and more specifically on the new geological era or epoch that ecological discourses and geological discourses are calling the Anthropocene. And that is the forthcoming book, my first monograph that I'm currently completing. So I will be mostly talking about that work and its relation to at least the kind of philosophical work that is emerging from the discourses around our ecological crisis and around a new geological epoch called the Anthropocene. So as I said, we could talk about anti-Blackness from the very different angle, especially if we're staging the intervention in philosophy. So, but what's interesting to notice, at least discern, is the kinds of similarities between different traditions, different themes, different topics in philosophy around when it comes to the question of race, but more specifically when it comes to the question of Blackness. I would say that the violences that Dr. Warren reads in classical ontology are similar to the kind of violences that I'm reading in these ecological discourses surrounding the future of our planet, the future of the world. And so when I really begin to decipher the general import of the term Anthropocene, my concern wasn't simply to understand its meaning, to discern what it announced, or even simply to measure the term's implications. It is indeed the case that Anthropos' imprints on what we might call provisionally nature is undeniable. And the degree to which men's power over the earth brought about massive regimes of techno ideology of survival is equally irrefutable. Thus, I wasn't necessarily concerned with the desire to contest geology's pronouncement, nor was I invested in assessing the the politics of scientific or philosophical nomenclature. In its preliminary phases, my work on the Anthropocene sketches out the tenuous grounds on which the term carves its discursive trajectories. Indeed, here the charges against the term range from obscurantism to frustration with a perceived misnomer that merely revived the the hegemonies of brute empiricism and naive pragmatisms at the expense of a vast range of critical work that had commendably displaced the Cartesian sensibilities at the root of modernity's violence. Many, many of these accusations are certainly not far-fetched, and critiques alleged paranoia cannot overstate the punctual resurgence of a scientific rationality well pruned for contemporary ecological anxieties. For instance, describing the new materialist discursive and ethical political shifts in light of the somewhat sensationalist proclamations celebrating the ends of the cultural and linguistic turns, Diana Kuhl and Samantha Frost point to a conceptual reliance on the developments in natural sciences as one of the main informative grounds for new materialism's ontological reorientation. And new materialism is really the philosophical discourse of this kind of like what we are calling broadly eco-criticism. As Jet Bennett points out, the problem with philosophy's practices of demystifications are its inevitable projections on human agency onto things, of human agency onto things. As a result, theory's limits are discernible in their political inefficacies to produce moral outrage. Bennett's theory of vibrant matter, however, remains decidedly scientific, while it acknowledges some aspect of matter's incalculability. But for those who continue to find some value in theoretical approaches to reading our current ecological predicament, science's proclaimed indisputability forecloses the possibility of disagreement, even doubt. Observing the Anthropocene's discursive landscape and discerning its general fault lines did not require strenuous interpretive efforts. The lines there were drawn, the theoretical rifts were visible, and the camp's rules of engagement were conspicuously legible in books titled Calls for Papers and on Proliferating Eco-Manifestos. More importantly, however, the ethos of a new salvific ontology was vigorously endorsed. Prosaic in its form and appeal, it prescribed a rather simple ethics. Namely, everything is inherently interconnected. Relationality is ontologically real. Species entanglement is thoroughly corporeal. And what we need is to rescue our ethical sensibilities from the longue durée of Cartesian temporality. However, as it is with any prescriptive discourse with a totalizing vocation, this new hyperethics of relationality contained disavowed ambiguities, unacknowledged contradictions, and structural complicities with the very discursive position they wished to denounce. For instance, the political framing of our current ecological crisis was foreclosed, while the construction and the maintenance of both new and old racial enmities proliferated. That is to say that insofar that we were earthbound, to use Bruno Latour's language, racial antagonisms could be relinquished to the past by reclaiming our stories of becoming with and of species companionships. Paradoxically, however, while critical theory's ostensible obsession with construction and composition was now supposedly inoperative in the face of our ecological demise, the very constructivist implication of this emerging ethico-political grand narrative were profoundly unacknowledged. More specifically, the driving assumption that the Earth is indeed reconstructible was the truth of the hour, which assumptively operated to enable an array of disavowals while concocting massive programs of technocratic repair in which one must include the new materialist philosophies of ecology and the environment. What still remains unassessed is the very contract of this ecological ethos. That is, who is this we of relationality? That question is hardly ever posed. Can Black people afford to abide to such romantic dictum according to which any configuration of a we the people, we the post-human, we the hyper-objects, we earthly beings can secure survival so long as we can resist together our ecological demise? Or is Fred Moten right to understand relationality as, quote, an expression of power structured by the givenness of a transcendental subjectivity that the Black cannot have, but by which the Black can be had, unquote? In other words, is relationality an ethical mode of captivity and confinement for Black people? It is precisely the sanctity of a virtuous thinking that entails racial defamation that I seek to unravel in my work when I turn to the figure of Blackness in the Anthropocene. More than only suggesting that Blackness necessarily redirects our inquiries to the intimate complicities between destructive violence and the imaginative virtues of ecological benevolence, I want to show that Blackness's ordinary experience of dispossession complicates the matters at hand. I seek to expose how Blackness, to paraphrase Jared Sexton, complicates thinking, makes resisting the Anthropocene difficult and uncomfortable by ruining these initial plans, by throwing things off balance, or to be more direct, by blackening things. Without, however, complying with the anti-Black compulsion of binding our critical investigation to the performative display of images of anti-Black violence, like genocide, rape, police brutality, fascist murders, xenophobia, and the many racial massacres or the anti-Black massacres globally on the rise, I am yearning for other means to account for the illegible suffering that continues to condition the ongoing logic of gratuitous murder, a logic whose victims are still racialized with cruel particularity. The relational ethics of the Anthropocene, it seems to me, might be yet another disguised iteration of a global anti-Black order of confinement, exploitation, and premature death. Hence, one of my responses to that ethics was to speculate with its incongruous opposite, with the antagonism of its oxymorons, like non-relationality. The exercise here isn't necessarily redemptive. It does not presumptuously seek for the cure of anti-Blackness. Rather, it represents a modality of disruption intended to jam discursive syntax, ethical arrangement, and a discourse's desire to secure its coherence by discarding the Earth's most vulnerable inhabitants. But I would be remiss, however, to conclude my short remarks today without turning to, albeit quite briefly, to some of the important ethical political rejoinders to our current ecological crisis in what we might call Black ecology. So it is perhaps in the midst of this that resounding demands for alternative accounts of ecology have carved their own conceptual landscapes. Counter histories of geoecologies are contesting, dismantling, and displacing the most rooted understanding of our contemporary world. While the range of their investments is heterogeneous, they seem nonetheless to share an underlying principle, and that is the conviction that another world is possible. Such a world, one that would no longer be chained to the cruelty of white supremacist domination, requires the cultivation of alternative imaginaries. And such imaginaries would dare to reclaim the intrinsic unruliness and disobedience of imagination, not merely as a fugitive plan, but also as a way to revive subterranean radical histories, the struggles of ancestors, the sacredness of the earth, the relation with the more than human, the critical insurgent knowledges of ecology's pariah or Black pariahs, and the dissonant maps from the most endangered sites of ecological harm and injury. I think it would be fair to say that the field of Black ecology is a leading voice in the radicalness of the endeavors. Black ecology's commitments are not so much diachronic and even less so synchronic, insofar as the task, or one could say the poetic activity of Black ecological poiesis, isn't so much the tracing of alternative historicities, but the imaginative creation of a radically new world, an otherwise world, a Black world. In its most radical form, the imagined escape of a Black world would aim to dehistoricize the Blackness of such world by putting it out of reach from the violence of historical reflection and historical experience. It will be done shortly. But what would, and in light of all this, what would a Black world be if not a world anterior to experience, insofar as experience connotes the limitations of a hermeneutic historicity, of a conscious, self-possessed Cartesian I fully in charge of its signifying process? But it is worth here asking whether a Black world could be translated into the language of experience without betraying its Blackness. Is a Black world, therefore, an objective statement with no conceivable object? I am confronting these questions at a point in my thinking whereby I seem to be discerning the somewhat frightening possibility that the imaginative vision for a different Black order is uncannily converging with the salvific aspirations of Anthropocene ontologies. Like the post-apocalyptic times of a post-Anthropocene world, the givenness of a Black world is unambiguously redemptive. Its future lies decidedly outside of destruction, and the programmatic appeal of alternative imaginaries have replaced the interruptive nature of its aphoretic disruption. I guess I'm saying that I'm reaching a point in my thinking where I'm continuously hitting a dead end whereby it appears that our project of critical demystification are forced to produce their own form of uncritical mystification, precisely in the very act of their attempting to disentangle the powers of alternative imagination from the legislating force of the proper, of the disciplined. Thus decidedly narrating the promises of a Black world, thereby relinquishing its non-referentiality, reduce its difference to a simple logic of equivalence, whereby difference is merely understood in terms of adequation. Could this be forcefully returning the Blackness of such world to the violence of authenticity? And if the formulation Black world bears the traces of the philosophical concept of world, how are we to bear the brunt of conceptual inheritance or the torment of discursive transmissibility. What gets lost from foregoing the glimmers? What gets lost for, and that's a question, what gets lost from foregoing the glimmers of fugitive plans? How shall we inherit responsibly from unbearable conceptuality? And here I am including the concept of world. What kind of relationship to the structures of world making can we sustain as its unwanted and yet indispensable ingredients? Can we indeed envisage the possibility of world making without falling prey to the logic of settlement and appropriation? Putting the legacy of world making to rest would perhaps entail the necessity of facing the irremediable cruelness of imagination. And if putting such a legacy to rest must remain our most precious though difficult task, we might, in my opinion, let Blackness as the unsayable preside over the impossible possibility of such an event. For choosing Blackness's immeasurableness might strike this world with its last blow without nonetheless the illusion of a final salvation. Thank you.
Dr. Guerrero, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. We are certainly delighted to be able to engage you this evening and talk a little bit more about the particularities and the vestiges of your presentation. I want to say to the audience that is watching online, if you all have any questions at any time, feel free to drop them in the comments section on Facebook Live. I am able to see them, as is our presenter for this evening, and we'll be happy to engage you all. So as this conversation unfolds this evening, feel free to ask any pressing and relevant questions that you all may have for Dr. Carrera or for myself, but primarily for our presenter this evening. You have talked extensively, Dr. Carrera, about a couple of pieces, especially the ways in which Black ecology aims to dehistoricize Blackness out of this kind of historical violence. I'm wondering if you can say more about that in terms of the kind of dehistoricizing Blackness from this kind of historical violence, perhaps radically rethinking the vestiges of that and the implications of it for us today.
Sorry, I think I missed the beginning of your question. I'm sorry. Can you repeat the question again? Sorry,
Sure. No, so you mentioned just briefly about the ways that Black ecology aims to dehistoricize Blackness from this kind of historical violence. And so I'm wondering if you can say more about that in terms of what the implications of that are today and how that might manifest social imagination, public sphere, ecologically as well, in terms of this dehistoricizing Blackness, the ways that it's been subsumed in historical violence.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's definitely a great question, a difficult one as well. So what I seem to be at least discerning or reading in Black ecological thinking is not just mailing kind of like a counter narrative or speaking back to the power or speaking back to the ecological establishment or this discursive establishment of ecological thinking. It seems to me that there is a concise, or at least an investment in imagining. I can hear my echo for some reason, or I don't know, this weird sound. But what I'm trying to say is that there are also a noticeable investment into thinking the possibility of a radically different world than the one that we have now. And I think the very notion of an otherwise world has somewhat been a central formulation in a current iteration of ecological thinking in Black studies. So the point here is that I'm saying, Black ecology isn't merely saying, let's talk back to power and let's, uncover what is show to the world, or reason with this violent world. I'm saying that what I'm noticing as well is a certain kind of investment into a radical imaginary. So what I attempt to do in light of that is to then think about the structure of that investment, but specifically think about the structure of that refusal, the refusal to be part of a violent history or to be part of a world that carries its own anti-Black violence, right? Is it possible, in fact, to say, that we could somehow envisage a world that is radically different from the one that we have now? What are the processes of destruction that would make that world possible, right? And what are the structure of these practices of destruction? And I think one of the implications is precisely a certain kind of an implicit dehistoricization of Blackness, of putting Blackness out of history, of pulling Blackness out of its morbid and lethal history. And I think this is more of an observation of my part than it is an argument, right? What I'm trying to say is that what does it really mean to have a radically different world and to conceive of a world that have no reference, that has no referential concept so far, right? It would mean, for instance, that what the world that we're talking about is a world that is before experience, right? That is completely outside of the realm of experience. I guess that's what I meant by the dehistoricization of Blackness as an implicit character of this what remains for me at least an impossible possibility or a possible impossibility that a Black world is, right? So essentially, I'm saying that the possibility of a Black world or thinking a Black world still has no real reference. So we're essentially trying to make sense of a possibility that has no referential concept at this point.
Thank you for that, and I appreciate that. I have a follow-up question for you that probably won't be any easier for you to unpack because the density and the depth of your scholarship is extremely thought-provoking for us. So you talked about a little bit in your presentation the ways that Black ecology provides for us another world that is possible, not chained to the dominance of white supremacy, that in some ways allows us to reclaim I think you said radical histories and reclaiming social imagination in terms of the sacredness of the earth. I immediately thought about Ta-Nehisi Coates' work, Between the World and Me, in which he said when they would have to determine how to build their suburbs on something other than human bones, how to angle their jails towards something other than a human stockyard, how to erect a democracy independent of cannibalism. I'm wondering, as I was listening to your response, what are the processes and the structures that allow for this kind of deconstruction of the world that is ecologically, and for the building of a Black world that in some ways sounds tangential or theoretical in some ways?
What is the, sorry, maybe could you speak a little slower? This is the last part of your question.
I'm curious about the processes and structures that you spoke of that allow for us to, in some ways, as you mentioned, demystify or deconstruct these projects of whiteness, as I was reading from Coates and thinking about the ways that you mentioned this Black ecology provides for us another world that is not chained to the dominance of white supremacy as it relates to reclaiming social imagination and radical histories.
I mean, I think my work is mostly, it's an effort. It's that former effort, So let me just be clear. I guess I'm still in. I guess the kind of radical doubt that informs my work in relation to this philosophical tradition that we may call, I don't know. There are so many discourses in this kind of like Western eco-criticism, new materialism, speculative realism, certain kind of like a general, we may call environmental humanities. And, there are philosophical interventions, there are literary interventions, etc., artistic interventions, etc. And so what I was trying to do, what I'm trying to do is to sort of, rather than merely fall into the kind of like programmatic endeavors of coming up with a set of prescription on how to survive this current ecological demise, what I'm trying to read is what these prescriptive programs and appeals and plans even disavow and erase. And most of the time, as I was saying in what I read today, when you pay attention at this somewhat compulsory we that is supposed to be somewhat, joining force to face this last almost this last historical task. Seems to me that after the Anthropocene, what we have essentially, what we're facing is kind of like the end of history, right? Kind of like, so basically the practices are very much eschatological in this sense, right? And so so what I'm trying to do here is to think about these spaces of disavowal, of erasure, and what they are serving for this discourse. Why is it that, for instance, the problem of differential responsibility on in about who's responsible for getting us here, right? This is a problem that's oftentimes approached from very from an anthropological lens, hardly ever from an ontological one, or even a metaphysical one or philosophical one generally. Why is this question hardly ever asked, right? And who inhabits these spaces of erasure? And so who is forgotten, and why are they forgotten? Are these erasure actually serving a specific, doing kind of like, or performing a specific kind of labor, right? And essentially, what I've noticed, or at least what I'm discerning, is essentially the position of the Black in these spaces of erasure, and how that the erasure of Blackness is somewhat necessary for the building of that discursive, how would I say this? Basically, what I'm saying is that Blackness is, or the erasure of Black suffering, essentially, appears to be necessary for the coherence of this new ethic of relationality. Essentially, the moment you pose the question of Blackness, right, is the moment you force the condition of the Black onto this ethical, tradition, or I'm losing my term here. What happened is that just everything is disrupted. There's kind of like a visible disruption in the discourse. I'm not sure if I'm responding. I'm answering your question, but what I really saying is that I'm less interested in the prescriptive aspect of things than in the attempt to reading the silences, the erasure, and the deliberate amnesia, so to speak. And there are multiple methods of doing that, but one of them is it's always the kind of like impose the question of Blackness on a discourse that refuses to speak of Blackness, and to see really where that leads us.
Yes, this is absolutely wonderful. There are a couple of questions for us in the chat. I see one from Jordan Malky. He's a PhD student at Northwestern University. He says, "Thank you so much, Professor Carrera. I'm wondering if you could think out loud about how the insufficiencies of Anthropocene ethics and Black ecologies also reveal a fundamental insufficiency at the heart of Christian ethics and Black theology. Put differently, can Black people love their neighbor as they love themselves, as the Christian conceit suggests?"
First of all, I'm gonna say I'm just gonna name my shortcomings right away. I'm just like I don't think I'm equipped to make an insightful comment on matters of theology. But I do have neighbors, and I loved once in my life, so maybe I can, in the sense that I mean, I also was raised Catholic. I mean, the question of love and is one, the question of proximity and the question of love are very difficult questions. I think what it would mean really when it comes to Blackness, I think the question would be, I mean, I don't know, what it would mean to actually love an impropriety. Because I think the point here is that my point of departure isn't, I'm not, I mean, I cannot assume to know what Blackness is. And I think this is where that's really my departure. You know, this is where I begin. And I think most of my wrestling is very much haunted by that unknowability or that impropriety, I would say. So what does it mean to actually love the improper? What does it mean to love an impropriety?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know. I think that the language of love is always so associated and attached with the language of authenticity. That is to say, you have to be profoundly familiar with what you're loving in some, or at least there has to be some profound proximity with the object of love. And I mean, obviously, the proximity is implied in the notion of neighbor, or in the figure of the neighbor, right? So I can't answer the question really, because I don't know what it means to love an unknowable distant figure or thing. So I guess it's an interminable question. It's a question that somewhat haunts all of my work, all of our work, I think. And that is, you know, how do you speak of something that has no universal concept, you know, has no conceptual reference. Yeah, I mean, I'm just not equipped to answer that question whatsoever. But thank you. But thank you so much for the question. Again, it's more than anything. It I guess it reveals how difficult it is to to speak about Blackness and to let Blackness really guide your thinking. Um, so essentially, what I'm saying is that it's meant to you're meant to be kind of like lost
Mm-hmm.
and multiple times.
As I'm listening to you think out loud about this, and I'm looking at Jordan's question, I'm often struck with, the kind of fundamental question: well, what does it mean to love, right? What are the necessary and sufficient conditions, or necessary and satisfactory conditions for one to have said love? And is this a requirement? I think this is what Jordan is getting at in some regards, as he talks about the kind of insufficiency of Christian ethics, or maybe even deontological ethics, right? Duty ethics, right? This is often something that is promulgated in theological discourse, this notion of love in some regards. And so, Jordan, if you're still listening, I hope that Dr. Carrera was able to maybe help to push the envelope a little bit further. But what do you exactly mean when you say love their neighbor? Perhaps can you help us understand some of the sentiments of what you mean by love, right? Looking at this philologically and etymologically, there are different iterations of love. And then also, when you say the neighbor, are we talking about those that do not identify as Black as well? I think this is something that's critical to the dialogue and has been historically. So we'll come back to that. Jordan, if you're still with us, feel free to post a follow-up question. Dr. Carrera, I'm sure would love to continue thinking out loud about that. There's another question from Kyle Stevenson, a brilliant mind, Morehouse graduate, Emory graduate. His question is, what does this mean for the concept, or as Sean Copeland would say, the idolatry of the world, of the way the world constructs what it means to be human? A follow-up is, if it is constructed over Blackness against humanness. And I think Kyle is referencing her text, Enfleshing Freedom, Body, Race, and Being here.
So what does it mean? Sorry, can you read the question again?
Yes. What does this mean for the concept, or as Sean Copeland would say, the idolatry of the way the world constructs what it means to be human?
What does it mean for the concept? Generic concept. Are we speaking of the concept in a generic way, right?
That's what I'm getting here in terms of what's being intimated from Kyle. And then the follow-up piece is if it is constructed over Blackness against humanness.
I think that this is what I was trying to get at. Some of the things that I was saying in response to Jordan's question was precisely to say there is no concept of Blackness. Blackness has no concept. Blackness has no language of its own, right? So what does it mean to actually have a concept that only names, that only misrecognizes a figure that has no concept, right? A concept that can only mistranslate a figure that has no language. What does it mean to actually translate the void, right? When translate, the very structure of translatability presupposes the existence of a language. What does it mean to actually translate a no language, a language that doesn't exist? So if you understand concept to be iterations, linguistic iteration of existing entities, what does the concept mean when I think this the other I'm having trouble understanding the connection between the first part of the question and the last part of the question, because the last part of the question seems to be referring to the concept of world and its relationship to the human, right? And how does Blackness actually fit in this situation, in this kind of like this conceptual landscape? Again, I think one of the kind of like hermeneutic impulses that we currently have in Black philosophy, Black studies, Black critical theory, however you position yourself within, the rather internally differentiated space of thinking Blackness. We have this tendency of saying, Blackness subtends, coherence and consistency. And obviously, I'm putting the concept in this plane of coherence, and we can add the concept of world, and we can add the concept of the human in this plane of coherence, if you may call it, legibility, this plane of legibility. And we tend to say that Blackness subtend that legibility. I think that we have yet to really think about what that actually means. What does a note concept really? It's not just merely a mistranslated or misrecognized concept, right? We're talking something that is more than just merely an impropriety, as I was talking about earlier, but perhaps something that is akin to what David Marriott calls a nothing that is less than nothing, right? A nothing that does not, accomplish the work of negation, right? What does it mean to actually have a no concept or a nothing that is less than nothing subtend the space of conceptuality? I don't know what that looks like, or I wouldn't be able to think about it on the top of my head right now. But I do think that this is a difficult way of thinking the very notion of conceptuality altogether. And I think one of the things that it does actually is to show us how fragile the space of conceptuality is. And that's probably the reason why every time we tend to insert the question of Blackness or to insert Blackness as a no concept, if you might like it, onto the space of legibility, how just things, move quickly. They lose their their coherence and legibility quite quickly, right? So the space of legibility, conceptual legibility, essentially, I'm saying, is quite fragile, perhaps because it is subtended by something that is radically unspeakable, radically unknowable. I'll leave it to that then, if I made sense.
Yeah, this is extremely important. I think that's central to the discourse in many ways, right? This kind of illegibility of Blackness in that way. And I think that's something that is picked up by Warren in his text, Ontological Terror. For those who may not have joined us at the beginning, the meditation for Thurman Thursday was taken from Ontological Terror, in which he descriptively writes about Blackness as nothingness, in many ways looking at Heideggerian metaphysics. So Jordan has a follow-up question, and there's another question from who I'm looking at, Christopher Ringer. Jordan's follow-up question is, he said, I would be interested in you speaking more on how the neighbor and the Black might be irreconcilable concepts, and what that means for global ethics in an age of refugee crisis. Mm-hmm. So I think that helps to frame what Jordan was attempting to say about the neighbor in that regard. Mm-hmm. 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 So next question.
Jordan, with with the hard questions all the time. Um, um, I mean, um, if you think about the figure of the refugee at this moment, um, or in the past perhaps decade or so, um, in spite of the innumerable number of Black refugees who are currently drowning into the Mediterranean Sea, the global figure of the refugee isn't Black, if you really think about it. Um, um, and I wonder why, right? And I wonder what it means for hospitality. Um, because you can't really receive a host, or at least the general legal structure of hospitality require that the guests is somewhat recognizable, right? So that recognizability implies a certain kind of proximity. You are a stranger. You're a stranger that I will um, uh, uh, receive in my home, but you have to be, but the condition of receivability, right? The condition of that hospitality are predicated on my ability to recognize you as a foreigner, to recognize you as someone who isn't from here, right? So what I'm asking, so in many ways, the neighbor is never someone who's part of my house. The neighbor always lives outside of my house, right? So there has to be, the neighbor connote a certain kind of like approximate a strangeness, like approximate foreignness, right? You are the person who lives next door, essentially. And my ability to receive the neighbor is predicated on my ability to recognize the neighbor as a foreign other, a stranger that that lives elsewhere and that is worthy of my hospitality. Right? And I wonder what it actually means. I think this is one of the things that escapes the very structure, or at least that is a certain kind of a kind of an exorbitance to the very structure of hospitality, is that stranger that is radically unrecognizable, right? That stranger that exceed the very notion, the very concept of strangeness or foreignness, right? And I think one of the reasons why um, the refugee crisis seems, or at least the figure of the Black refugee seems to be a hardly an afterthought, and perhaps not even a thought altogether lately, is precisely because of the condition of of the figure that we were looking at, essentially this figure that is just completely radically outside of the very structure of legibility, right? And therefore the structure of the possibility of hospitality. So here I'm saying is that can we in fact say, does the Black actually, or does Blackness occupy the space of, or can Blackness be, can the Black be a neighbor? I think that's what I'm asking, you know. And again, what I'm really trying to do here is just to cultivate a constant and ongoing radical doubt about the givenness of these concepts, the naturalness of these concepts. I think I'll leave it there, maybe. I could keep rambling.
No, you're not rambling at all. You're actually making a lot of sense, and I appreciate you. I think that this question is important. When can the Black be a neighbor? I'm thinking about Victor Anderson's work, ethicist, of course, at Vanderbilt Divinity School, in his text Beyond Ontological Blackness, in which he kind of argues that the extent of Blackness is not phenomenologically reducible to that of suffering. I'm wondering what are some of the alternative possibilities of Blackness if suffering is not kind of central to the discourse, as a number of theologians and philosophers have written over the years. But I don't want to push the conversation too far that way, because that can take us in a completely different direction. I want to make sure that we're attending to some of the questions in the chat. There's another question from Christopher Ringer. The question that is posed here is, does Blackness constitute an absence as a perpetual presence?
The short answer is yes. Or rather, provisional yes, I would say. I don't think I have much to say more than really providing the provisional yes. When you're talking about something that has no conceptual reference, that has no real that has no authentic referentiality, you're speaking about something that is more than just mere absence. And I think that's the difficulty here. I think what we're trying to do is to think something that exceeds the very dichotomy between absence and presence. The dichotomy, the opposition between absence and presence. Because when you speak about absence, one of the implications that that absence is always provisional, right? You're already positing the possibility of finding the object, the lost object, and I'm not sure I'm ready to concede on that. Yes.
There's another, so this is almost like a follow-up question from Spencer Neighbors, graduate of Spelman, currently a PhD student at Northwestern University as well. Make sure I'm seeing this correctly. Does the illegibility of Blackness blur or even erase all lines of relationality? I think you touched on this earlier when talking about the kind of erasure of Blackness in a particular way, but this is a question from Spencer.
Yes. Why? Because I'm not ready to concede to the very contract of the concept of relationality, and more specifically, its assumption of its natural universality. If perhaps we're talking about a different kind of relationality, but it would be we would have to call it something else than relationality. So yes, it does. I hope I've answered the question. I'm trying to make my answers short.
Well, you say you're not ready to make concessions about relationality. What does that mean exactly for those who may not?
I'm saying that there is a specific kind of like discursive contract to the very notion of relationality. That is to say, first of all, we have to have a notion of the we that would then be in relation among its different entities and component, right? But I don't think that this we is as easily definable, and I don't think Blackness actually occupies that we at all. So if we're going to speak about a kind of relationality that doesn't abide to this, or at least that doesn't obey this kind of assumptive universality that is necessarily implied in the philosophical concept of relationality, right? We would have to be talking about something else, right? And so relationality necessarily implies a kind of mutual legibility. I have to be able to recognize you in order for me to be in relation with you, right? So this is why I said, my quick answer, which I stand by, really, is no. And if we want to speak about something else, right, that can come close to describe the I almost have no real language to describe this. I try to call it non-relationality in a paper that I published a couple years ago. I try to call it non-relationality, but it had no prescriptive aspect to it, right? The aim of the very notion of non-relationality that I was putting there was actually to kind of like disrupt the ethical arrangement of relationality as a natural ethical term, right? So it was more of a mode of disruption of kind of what I said, what I called a jamming the discursive and ethical machine, really. So yes, no, that illegibility has no space or has has no space within the very conceptuality of relations. We would have to be speaking about something else.
So there's another follow-up question here from Jordan. How does this Black non-relationality relate or not relate to the theory of relationality through opacity? I think this is a beautiful question. Are you able to, did you catch that?
Yes, can you, but let me make sure that I understood, that I read it right. Can you read it again?
It should be displayed on the screen for us. How does this Black non-relationality relate or not relate to a theory of relationality through opacity?
Yeah. Oh gosh, this will take forever.
Do as best you can. We're coming to a close. But by all means, feel free to elaborate. I have a few more questions myself.
I mean, maybe it does come close, but why? I mean, maybe it does come close. I'm not sure, because one of the things that the concept of opacity imply or carries with it, it's the assumption of a shared world, right? So in many ways, we live in this space, on this thing, or we share this thing called world, right? And within that space of shareability, we ought to be able to protect our sovereign desire for opacity. So, I mean, claiming opacity, it's a sovereign act, right? I mean, it's a form of, of Black sovereignty, if you might call it that way. Again, because what I mean by non-relationality isn't simply something that occurs at the level of experience, right? I'm not sure Glissant's notion of relationality and non-relationality converge on many points, if I may say that. First of all, I mean, not first of all, one of the non-convergence, or at least one of the point of departure between non-relationality, where I think what I'm thinking I'm doing with non-relationality and Glissant's notion of relationality is that I do not assume that we share the world in that sense, precisely because I think I'm less interested in what the kind of discursive interruption that I'm staging with that term is doing directly at the level of experience. I think I'm thinking about it in the vein of what Professor Warren is doing in ontological terror at the level of ontology, really. And I would have a lot of things to say about the kind of like the assumption about sovereignty that the concept of opacity entails, but that I would have, it would take me forever. We would just kind of like move into something completely different. So I'll just stop here.
So I'm curious as to if you might say more about that concept of Black sovereignty in that regard, to help us to kind of frame or situate in some regards. And this will be our last question. I don't see any more in the chat. So if you want to take a few minutes just to unpack that for us, this notion of Black sovereignty as it relates to theory.
Unpack. That's always, I'm always like kind of like tickled by that because unpacking, I don't know. That takes years. But certainly can't do that in 2 minutes. But when I was saying, for instance, that, there are, what I'm doing, perhaps I'm kind of like meeting Professor Warren intervention, or at least the plane of its intervention, or the book's intervention, that is, at the level of ontology. I really meant, and I was saying, I'm speaking about something that is not necessarily confined within the realm of experience. I really mean, to really point to what I think is, all right, let me rephrase this. I don't think Blackness can actually be phenomenologically read, because, the very, the project of phenomenology presupposes a self-possessed I, sovereign I that could somewhat stage a kind of voluntarist, course of behavior or existence in that sense. I don't think that that kind of sovereignty is one that we can readily claim in that sense. And here I'm really following. I'm following Fanon's work. And what I'm trying basically to get at is that, the very concept of I really is a kind of luxury, not a luxury, or perhaps it's kind of like a phenomenological entity that we can't easily claim. Because some of the ontological imposition on us mean that some of our, that our claim to sovereignty are always already disrupted by non-sovereign realities, or by the how would I say this? I just can't easily claim the language and the structure of sovereignty that, let's say, being can, in that sense. Precisely because, as Dr. Warren shows in the book, the concept of being is something that that isn't a kind of like a possibly a possession that the Black can possibly claim, essentially, or it can easily claim in that sense.
Right, right.
So that's the form of that's the non-sovereignty that I'm talking about. And I'm not saying that non-sovereignty doesn't do any kind of work. I'm not talking about, this kind of like passive being that is there receiving all forms of anything, right? And endures just all forms of violences, etc. I think that there is a concept of sovereignty or there is a kind of like a sovereign non-sovereignty that we may perhaps begin to think about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, as I listen to you talk about this notion of sovereignty, and I know we're wrapping up here, I'm thinking about the ways that Warren talks about the way that linguistics takes place in philosophy lacks the necessary grammar, traditional thought in some regards, right? That this kind of ontological, he says, is an ontological catastrophe that is produced by the disparate grammars that produce collusion as well. And so I think that in many ways the reading of Warren in that regard, coupled with your, unpacking of this, or not unpacking, but at least thinking out loud, as you said, is in some ways something that we have to continually work through, right? With this notion of Blackness being a puzzle or a great abyss, as Warren says. Dr. Carrera, I want to thank you so much for your time tonight. And I'm sure that there are a host of individuals who are watching tonight who are extremely appreciative of the kind of intellectual labor that you've done and for the scholarship that you have produced and that you continually produce. We are extremely grateful for you taking the time out of your evening to join us here at Morehouse and the Martin Luther King Jr. International Chapel Assistance Program. Again, on behalf of Dr. Carter and Reverend Quincy Reinhardt, we extend our deepest thanks, and to all of those persons who engaged in the chat. We thank you all for watching and engaging with us tonight as well. There is one last question for you, Doctor. And that question is very simply, what are some texts that you are reading now, or what are 3 texts that you would recommend for current students to read?
Oh, 3 texts? Again, that's kind of like the question of that formulation of unpacking. 3 texts. Well, I don't know if I can give you 3 texts. I mean, I think that David Merritt's last essay on it's for Blackness Nipa. It's in this great journal run by 2 Black scholars, Proctor Noss. So that essay on Blackness and Nipa, which is not in French, which he pulls out of Fanon's work. I mean, I'll say anything that David Merritt has written, undoubtedly. Especially what for me is magnus opus with a Fanon. Wow. What else? I would say, obviously, always Saidiya Hartman's Scenes of Subjection. Always. That's sort of a bit of a Bible, I think. It ought to be a bit of a Bible for all of us. And I think Zakiya Jackson's Becoming Human is also an important place to think about, the question of difference, especially to think about the natural ways or the naturalization of normative terms, like the human, like Blackness, even, I think, like all the terms that we may include in the categories of gender, etc. You've read from Ontological Terror, obviously, that is also a decisive text, I think that's more than three, but I'm going to give myself the freedom to give more than three. I think that Eshim Dembe's on the Post Colony is a text that has been unfortunately been shadowed by a critique of Black reason, but I think that really this is foundational text that people, I think, ought to return to. And last but not least, I think Frank Wilderson, Red, White, and Black is definitely a decisive text for the future of Black critical theory, undoubtedly. So I'll name those, but I could keep going.
Again, thank you so much. We are greatly appreciative. And I do see that Jordan has posted a link to one of those texts in the chat. Thank you so much for doing that, Jordan. To mention Kyle Stevenson's text from earlier with Sean Copeland, I think that text that he was referencing was In Flesh and Freedom, Body, Race, and Being, explores ontology and theological anthropology as well for those who may be interested in theological anthropology in some regards. So again, thank you so much. I want to send out a reminder that on Sunday, March 28th at 5:30 p.m. for Palm Sunday, the guest preacher for the Vesper Hour is the Reverend Byron Coleman III. He is a graduate class of 1993 MDiv and the senior pastor of the 5th Street Missionary Baptist Church in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. So you all want to make sure that you all tune in on Sunday at 5:30 p.m., which is Palm Sunday, for the Vesper Hour. Again, we thank you so much for joining, and thank you to Dr. Carrera for taking the time to think out loud and to postulate and to present tonight on philosophy and anti-Blackness. You all have a great evening.